Hello everybody, it's Tech Talk and it's the Austrian Grand Prix, and that really can mean only one thing. Not least because this is a sprint weekend, there's not a huge amount of upgrades on display. It doesn't mean there's none, but there's a few. But it does mean that we're at a racetrack with a giant bull on a hillside, and it is a good chance to look at the design and evolution of the car that's leading the way in Formula One, the Red Bull, of course. And let's take a look at some of the things that have developed since the last time we looked at this car. And for me, the really big theme about the Red Bull, and we've talked about its ecclesiastical characteristics and the fact that it is so holy, is that inlet design, that inlet layout on the overall car and the cooling package on the car. And I think this is one of the big secrets that Red Bull are trying to exploit at the moment. Not just the roll hoops design, which they revised for this year. You're going to see air going in there on all cars. That's not a particularly big difference. But these shoulder coolers that are on both sides of the car were a fairly new and interesting innovation for this current generation of car design. But what goes on behind those coolers is actually quite interesting as well, because as some people say, what goes in must come out. And you can start to see some of the cooling outlets behind the inlets of the car, and how the air flows through the Red Bull is really, really important. And that is one of the big areas the team has been playing with. Now, we've all talked about this very distinctive shape of the inlet of the Red Bull with a small upper inlet and then a big, I think more aerodynamically dominated lower inlet, that vertical strip. Ferrari and Alpine have both gone the same way with the layout of their designs, but Red Bull are still the leaders on this. And Red Bull are mucking about with the design of these parts. As we work through the season, you can start to see Red Bull modifying some of the areas around that. So these coolers were a new addition, as we talked about before. But if you have a look at the actual inlet, the upper inlet, that's the one that's primarily used for cooling, the shape and size of this part here has been revised. At the Spanish Grand Prix last week, the team reduced the size of that inlet. Now, that wasn't to do with reducing the cooling overall. What that was all to do was managing the flow through the car and how that airflow comes out the back of the bodywork. And that's something Red Bull has been experimenting loads with. You see these side coolers on the flank of the car. When Red Bull first introduced this layout of car, you had these coolers. Now, sometimes they're completely blanked off, sometimes they're half open, and sometimes this rear section has louvers in it as well, so they can exit the air along the side of the bodywork. However, Red Bull have found that there's a bit more performance than anybody really expected to modifying these coolers on the side, and with the airflow coming out over the rear suspension, around the rear of the car, there are some big gains to be had from managing that flow. Red Bull can chop and change the designs they use in this area, so it is part of what they had planned all year long. But when you look underneath the bodywork, you can see that changing the bodywork on the outside has a pretty fundamental difference to what's changed on the inside. So here you can see those cooling louvers on the side panel that we saw before. But look, there's this whole channel leading to it, and what looks to me like the top of a cooler here. Now, when they shut off that side panel, which they do at various races, as I mentioned, you will see that actually that cooler underneath the bodywork has to be relocated. All of that ducting that leads to it on this exit, well, that has to be changed as well. And those changes underneath the bodywork, and particularly to the cooler layout, don't come out of that aerodynamic testing restriction. So Red Bull using the rules to their advantage, which a number of teams are doing. Ferrari's doing, Mercedes are doing, a number of other teams are doing it. So it's completely within the rules, but it is just quite clever utilization of the regulations. For anyone who does Formula Student, it's all about reading the rules first, of course, and you'll hear people like me go on at you all the time about that. Well, Red Bull have learnt those lessons very well. Read the rules first and use them to your advantage. And then it's not just those coolers on the side of the car, these coolers on the top of the car, and you can see big old holes on the top bodywork in these drag reducing channels either side of the main airbox of the car. Well, the air coming out of here, managing that flow, well, clearly that's going to have an impact on the rear wing and the rear bodywork aerodynamics. So managing that flow is super important. And what Red Bull have done with the new side pods is to try to change the flow and reduce the impact of these top coolers and the side coolers on the rear aerodynamics. To talk a little bit more in detail about why the team have done this and what the team have done, well, one of the team's engineers, Paul Monahan, was talking to our man Mike Seymour in the pit lane in Barcelona.
We have revised the cooling package a little bit. Again, you're just seeking efficiency on the car. It's particularly sensitive here, the Barcelona circuit, for aerodynamic efficiency. So there's an opportunity ahead of 3 races, potentially some warm ones coming up to get something onto the car. So we've pushed and pulled the side pods around a little bit, some diligent work, some very clever people.
You touched on the side pods there. Is there anything else you can tell us about that? You know, the process back at the factory, the lead up to these new parts coming to the car?
This process began sort of way back January time. We started to look at what other shapes we can get in there, working around the constraints that we've got. Obviously, there's a time factor to filter in because we scrabbled back from Canada. One car was in the wall, so we had to deal with that. And then try with some fabulous work from the hard-working guys in the factory. And we've got a slight upgrade here, and it's testament to all the hard work that's gone in over many months to get us here.
Fascinating stuff there from Paul Monaghan. Really clever people there at the team's ever-growing Milton Keynes facility. Still hasn't got local planning authority for that new wind tunnel yet. Red Bull still developing this car in the oldest wind tunnel in Formula One. It's been heavily upgraded over the years, but can trace its roots all the way back to 1947. It was first built for the Cold War aircraft. Quite an impressive facility that, the fact it's still cutting edge in Formula One. But moving on, you can see some of the little details as well. One of the little parts that Red Bull want to just be tweaking. They haven't changed this yet, but I'm expecting with the changes to the side pod, as future races go on, we're going to see some changes to these little cooling outlets, which nobody ever really talks about, around the rear suspension. Now, in theory, these holes are there to allow the suspension to come out the side of the bodywork and go up and down. In reality, the team are using it just to cool the car as well. But there is, of course, an aerodynamic impact to that. And the aerodynamic impact around the rear of the car also leads its way all the way around all those other little aero details. And this is something that Red Bull have been playing with. There's some beautiful details that have emerged in recent races on the Red Bull. This is a few races back, and you can see on Max Verstappen's car, just here on the end of the separated 2 wing elements from the end plate to the upper element of the wing. It's a pretty conventional layout for Formula One as it stands at the moment. But if we look more recently, this is the wing from this weekend's Austrian Grand Prix, though they have been running this layout for the last couple of races. There's this lovely little aerodynamic detail just between the 2 elements there. And this is something no other team has really experimented with, this little tiny sticky uppy bit just on the where the 2 elements join. And I think you're going to see a lot of other teams experimenting on this area. Looks like a tiny detail. The effect could be quite important, quite big. We'll have to see how that plays up and down the field if other people copy that direction. And then, like many teams, Red Bull have been playing around with the detail of their brake cooling ducts in recent races. Now, it may look like just a simple air scoop with a little challenge for the cooling coming out the back of it, but the shape of that part is absolutely critical to the aerodynamics around the front of the car. And if you look at the rear suspension and the rear brake layout, very similar story. You've got what looks like a fairly simple set of scoops until you start looking at how the scoops are arranged on the side bodywork and how the plate on the inner face of the rear wheel is designed. And when you start looking at it from the other side of the car, you realise just how complex some of these designs are becoming up and down the grid as well. And then even at the front of the car, you heard what I mentioned about what goes in, it must come out. Well, Red Bull still playing around with the cooling slots on the front of the car, consistently running those 2 driver cooling slots on the top of the front of the car. No other team has been using them at every single race, but Red Bull find those 2 slots really useful for driver cooling, or does it have a bit more of an aerodynamic impact? I suspect it's the latter. And then the slot in the tip of the nose shape, of course, was revised during the season, and it looks to me at some races like that panel goes a little bit concave at speed. Maybe a trick of the light, but Red Bull's still just working on that nose design, working every little detail of the car. Of course, changing the cooling layout isn't unique to Red Bull. I thought we'd take a look just to get as a comparison to Ferrari, who introduced this cooling layout at Imola. Completely new engine cover layout with these 2 cooling slots, cooling outlets on the side of the car. But if you look forward and look how the car has developed into Monaco, Ferrari's opened up the bodywork a bit more. Lower average speed, high temperature at Monaco. Not a great surprise to see that happening. And you can see they've opened up the bodywork. Asymmetric cooling layout, not unusual in Formula One, but sometimes looks a bit odd when you look at the car. Then coming into Austria this weekend, much bigger cooling openings on the car, and that's not something you normally expect to see in Austria, but then you think about it, it's high above the sea level, it does have an impact on the car, and the layout of the different circuits this season and the type of circuits Formula One is visiting does have an impact on car development. And to find out a little bit more about how it affected the Red Bull, Paul Monaghan once again is in the pits with Mike.
Well, if I look at this circuit and Silverstone, this circuit has some relatively quick corners in it. Silverstone has some that we won't brake for, so arguably they're just changes your straight line profile of the circuit. So both are relatively high speed. Again, given the aerodynamic sensitivity here of Silverstone, and we just pushed the end plate out a little bit, widened the wings, which is in no way disrespectful to those involved because it's anything but trivial. Austria's a little bit different, and you've got a combination of 3 long straights and 3 low speed corners and 3 quickish corners. So that one always presents a bit of a challenge. You're 1,000 metres above sea level, and we always love the curbs there, so it's going to have some fun in Austria as well. And it's a sprint race just to chuck us all into merry fun.
Oh, that's really interesting stuff there on how the calendar and the type of circuit affects the car development and how the teams prepare for this quite a long way in advance. But a lot of people are saying up and down the pit lane that Red Bull may have reached a development ceiling with this year's car, and there's not really too much to come from it. And that's why other teams are creeping ever closer to their lap time, particularly Max Verstappen's lap time. They've pretty much already eclipsed Sergio Perez's lap time, so maybe a bit more to come for car 11 in terms of how that car is set up around its driver. But if it's the case that Red Bull has reached its development ceiling, then maybe the team will switch off development on this concept and put all of their efforts into 2026 as soon as they're allowed to on the 1st of January. Well, answering that question in the pit lane is what we're here for, so let's hear what the team really think about that situation.
It feels to me as if we're sort of asymptoting on these regulations, but people way cleverer than I will find ways to put load on this car, get weight out of it, run it more efficiently. So we'll extract lap time for next year somehow. It will be an evolution. No one with 2026 looming is necessarily going to rip it all up and give us a new challenge. So let's we'll be judged relative to our opposition again, won't we? We will work hard. We'll produce the best car we can, and we'll see.
Of course, there is one little fly in Red Bull's development ointment going into the end of the 2024 season. And here it is. There's nothing wrong with the Honda power unit when it works, but there have been some reliability issues for Max Verstappen in particular.
Now I have an engine, what does it say? Engine fault?
Stand by.
And Max Verstappen has used up his complete allocation of turbochargers, control electronics, energy stores, the battery. He's also used up his complete allocation of combustion engines, MGU-Ks and MGU-Hs, which means any new parts that he take will result in a penalty. And everybody's pretty clear that Verstappen is not going to be able to finish the 2024 season without picking up at least one penalty. Rumour has it that Verstappen will be making a pit lane start in Spa. We'll have to wait and see, but that is a circuit where overtaking is possible. But even then, you've still got almost half of a Formula One season to do on just 2 power units. And in theory, each power unit is only designed to do 25% of the Formula One season. And I don't think he can get there without picking up even more penalties as the year goes on. So we may see Verstappen and Red Bull having to manage the performance of their power unit, and that could cost them more lap time than any new upgrades can bring. We'll just have to wait and see how significant this power unit situation really is for the Dutchman and his Mexican teammate.